Thank you very much. Thanks for sticking around this afternoon. It's wonderful to have you. We're going to have, I think, a really wide-ranging and important discussion on the future of military technology and specifically disruptors to the way we think about military technology. And you can't ask for a more talented or informed or better cultivated panel to do that. So joining me today, to my immediate left, General Philip Breedlove, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. Next to him, Thomas Szytowski, the Undersecretary of State for the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Poland. Next to him, retired Lieutenant General Howard Bromberg, Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at Lockheed Martin. Sarah Krebs, Associate Professor, Department of Government at Cornell University, and Franz Steffengadi, Associate Editor of The Diplomat in New York. So we're going to be discussing today disruptive military technologies, near-term, mid-term, far-term, but I think that you can't have a discussion about disruptive military technology without addressing cyber as a short-term idea, and especially from a military perspective. Now, we've got a lot of speeches, a lot of presentations at this conference that deal with cyber, but it's a big theme of this conference, but I think we need to address cyber-enabled influence warfare, what I sometimes called weaponized WikiLeaks, from the very beginning, because we lose sight of the fact that everything that the Kremlin has done through the FSB and through the GRU hacker squads, through APT-28 and APT-29, through Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, has been part of a military operation with political dimensions. So it's not a transparency movement. It's not an open information movement, which is how some news outlets have represented it. It is a Kremlin-backed military operation aimed at destabilizing Western alliances. And the proof of that is sitting to my left. One of their military targets is Philip Breedlove, who had his email hacked in July of 2015 by the FSB, by Fancy Bear, actually the GRU, by Fancy Bear, and leaked online. So you were getting hacked by the Russians before it was cool. I wonder, if you have a particular thought on how we can combat that, what needs to happen now to stop that from happening again?
So sure, thanks. First of all, thanks to the organizers for allowing us to be here and having what I think is an interesting discussion. I've watched our preparation by my panelists who are far smarter than I. And I think that we're going to bring some interesting thoughts to you today, and that's very good. The introduction of starting with cyber, I think, is a perfect place to begin the conversation. When I was first asked to talk about this disruptive technology piece, I immediately decided to do what people taught me when I dealt with the press sometimes, make the problem bigger and think a little bit about what you want to say. And I think of disruptive technology, I think more about what are things that would be disruptive that we could begin immediately, what are things that we might work on in the midterm, and then what are sort of long-term disruptive capabilities. And as I sat down to think about this, cyber was actually where I would start. Both of the media for competition that were mentioned in the introduction, the cyber piece and the information warfare piece, are being very disruptive on us right now. We are suffering disruptive effects from cyber and the information war. And so how do we answer this disruption? And I came to the conclusion, and my panelists may add some other thoughts, that this disruption in the short term, it actually needs to be answered by policy. We in NATO have incredible cyber capability, but we in NATO do not have an incredible cyber policy. In fact, our policy is quite delimiting, and it really does not allow us to even consider offensive operations as an alliance in cyber. And so a disruptive answer to these cyber attacks might first be a policy in NATO that would allow us to return fire, to offensively take the fight to the enemy, which is what we in the military want to do. A fighter pilot like me, we always say that the best defense is a good offense. If you have a missile in the air headed at your opponent, he's not worried about attacking you right now, he's worrying about surviving. And so I would opine, or I would offer that in the short term for cyber, it may be as simple as a policy change to allow us to be able to return fire and attack. And I think that the paradigm in the short term also matches extremely well for information warfare. I've been a bit vocal that we have not taken the field in information warfare. We are fighting because the enemy gets a vote, and the enemy is bringing information warfare to us in all of our capitals and to us as an alliance. We have elected again to act reactively and defensively. We are a boxer that has entered the arena and decided not to throw any punches, only to try to defend against the punches being thrown at us. So once again, in the information sphere, I think that we might have a disruptive answer by just changing the policy that we have, such that we could use our information capabilities to return fire to the enemy. Think about it, and I'll just refer to the United States of America right now. Think about the capability in Hollywood. Think about our ability to create messages, and they don't have to be false messages, but create messages to get to the world the truth, vice the world hearing over and over very complicated versions of a lie that is used to shape our thought. So those are my short-term thoughts. Disruptive capabilities might be as simple as changing policy and better utilizing tools that we already have.
So when you take that question of a NATO-wide policy for offensive cyber operations, when you take that to Washington, what sort of reception do you get?
Well, it's not really Washington that's the issue.
Yeah.
In this case. Sometimes my capital is the most challenging of the NATO capitals, but in this case it's not. It's really about the NAC and our nations, each one being a sovereign nation, wanting to be involved in messaging and being able to look at messages in a very sovereign way. And that makes it very hard to answer as a collectively at speed in the information space or in the cyberspace.
Okay, so that's the disruption that we're living through right now. When you look ahead a little bit to the midterm technological forces that are going to shake the status quo of the way the military does business, what do you see?
So I'm just going to frame, I think, midterm, and if you'll allow me, frame far term a little bit, because the panelists have some great, more specific things to think about. As a SACUR, there were a couple of things that really bothered me, and I think they are places where in the midterm we can develop technology that could change the face of the threat that we see out there. And the first one, frankly, is the A2AD, anti-access area denial threat. The most prominent one to us being in the Kaliningrad Oblast and what we face there. So what are the technologies that allow us to reduce this capability? If we attack A2AD straight ahead in a conventional way, like we have in the past, it will take a lot of sorties and a lot of precision weapons to knock down the A2AD, which will clearly influence our ability to reinforce in a Baltic situation. So what are those technologies that will help us to reduce the A2AD threat quickly? Some of those disruptive technologies, I think, are already being worked on. Swarming capabilities to overcome radar defenses, swarming decoys, and swarming precision long-range weaponry. It's not enough that we can swarm. What would enable that swarm is machine-to-machine intelligence actions. If one set of decoys are already being targeted, don't keep sending decoys against that specific site and divert the decoys to another site. So machine to machine, I don't think it's quite artificial intelligence yet, but machine-to-machine conversation that allows our decoys and those penetrating strike weapons to be able to get to the target, learn on their way in, understand who's being targeted and who needs to be released to attack. And frankly, since we have primes in here who build things, I would like to challenge these to think about, if we are going to swarm, we need to be able to buy quantity. So a disruptive technology is developing long-range precision at a price that allows us to buy in depth so that we can swarm and attack. So how do we do those things?
So
and I'll leave some of the other
long-term
ideas to the panel.
So that's kind of a midterm range that we're thinking about a little bit. When you go out a little bit further, the long-term 10, 20 years, what are we not being prepared for?
So I would challenge you to the following. Remember the first time that you saw Star Trek and they had their little communicators and you thought, wow, this is absolutely incredible. And you think about what their little communicators did, and it's about 1/100th of what one of these would do. So I'm going to propose a few things that you will laugh at, and then I'll let the panel again talk at other ideas. But I think in the long term, we are going to cross over a couple of boundaries that we haven't crossed yet. The first one in the human genome, gene editing, developing human beings who are weapons, developing the soldier. Gene editing, I think, is one of those long-term disruptive technologies. And then the second one is, I think in the future, we are not going to ever really think about a boundary between our atmosphere and space again. Again, you may laugh. I think, maybe not me, but my son will see an X-wing fighter fighting from Terra into space or fighting from space into space. Think of the first nation that reaches the ability to fly a space plane up and take a satellite out, remove it physically or destroy it. Think about the first nation that fights from the moon and what kind of access that they may have. So I'm being provocative, but I think in the long term, we have to think about how amazed we were by the communications devices in Star Wars, and now how simple they seem. And I think that we will see gene editing, arranging and building soldiers might be on the future. And I think that we will soon forget that there's a boundary between our Earth and space, and we will fight through that medium. So I put those out there as grenades.
Yeah.
They'll go off and we'll see what people have to say.
Right. Well, as you can see, this is why the occasion of this particular panel is so important right now, because technology moves so quickly that some of the things that we identify today as midterm or long-term disruptors are kind of here in the present in one form or another, perhaps in a way that we haven't fully accommodated. For instance, I recently went down to Tampa, I saw General Ray Thomas, he's the head of SOCOM, and he told me this story about a recent encounter that some of his guys have. He said about 5 or 6 months ago, it was a day that the Iraqi effort almost came to a screeching halt. Literally in the span of 24 hours, there were up to 70 drones in the air at one time, and he's not talking about allied drones. He's talking about little consumer off-the-shelf drones that members of ISIS bought. They jimmied with explosives, and they were hovering overhead. And he said, at one time, 12 killer bees, if you will, right overhead. This is what he's talking about. These little DJI Phantom drones that ISIS had rigged were floating over the head of the Special Operations Forces working with the Iraqi military in Mosul. So that's a reality sort of right now. And I wonder, Stefan, in thinking about what's the difference between a disruptive technology that's a military technology and just a military technology? Does history give us any sense of how to do that quickly and easily?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I actually would want, in order to answer that question, I would like to move away perhaps briefly from technology. And that is, I think, what makes an effective disruptive military technology is when it is applied with the right tactics and the right operational concept. And I think that sometimes that gets forgotten when we talk about disruptive military technologies. if you look at historical examples, you can basically divide up the impact of disruptive military technologies into three phases. There's usually what I would call, and what some other scholars have called, an embryonic phase, where a new military technology, disruptive military technology, gets introduced. And the military, being a slow-moving bureaucracy and generally often not very adept at adapting to a new environment, doesn't really know what to do with this new technology. So they try out different things, and it usually fails to actually disrupt existing warfighting methods. Just think of the tank that was introduced in the First World War in 1917. Didn't really have a decisive impact. Where things get a little bit more interesting is the next phase, the so-called immature phase, where this disruptive military technology gets more widely adapted by different actors, different militaries, and people are really thinking hard about how to integrate this new technology and how to maybe introduce new tactics or a new operational concept. Mm-hmm. And how you figure out that you are in that phase is when you are actually engaged in war, you achieve a decisive victory. Again, just think about the Second World War and the German victories between 1939 and 1941. Or think about the first Gulf War when it comes to precision strike capabilities, a decisive victory. And then the next phase is the so-called mature phase, where a disruptive military technology is disseminated wide across militaries across the world, and everyone is sort of copying whatever guaranteed the success of the military that achieved a decisive military victory in the previous phase. Here the example is, the paradox here is that by disseminating this new technology across the board and copying tactics and operational concept, this new technology then turns out to be not as disruptive anymore. So my argument would be, actually, when we talk about A to AD, the general mentioned, I don't really see a lot of these capabilities as they are today as genuinely disruptive. They could become disruptive, again, when we increase quantity, for example, of some of these weapons. But I don't think that at the end of the day, for example, precision strike capabilities will have a decisive impact in the outcome of military conflict. And I think the historical example clearly shows that when everyone has similar capabilities, of course, the quality might be different, weapon systems might be slightly different, we are entering a new phase of warfare where it's really about attrition rather than disrupting the enemy with new tactics or technologies. And I think that's a phase that you want to avoid in the long run.
Okay. So, Secretary Chitowski, in thinking about how you handle or approach this problem from a policy perspective, I understand that the government of Poland is working through a strategy document that outlines some of your approaches, and I think it's particularly relevant because, of course, this is a government that's right on the cusp of a huge adversarial neighbor that's very adept at disruptive tactics, techniques, and procedures. So tell us a little bit about the strategy that you're looking at.
Thank you very much for bringing that up, and I'm really honored to be part of this distinguished panel. Indeed, I thought it would be useful to add some perspective from a non-first-tier actor. And for non-first-tier actors, I think disruptive technologies are indeed important, because when you look at technologies that are developed in a linear way, I think that the obvious advice for a second-tier actor would be not to go for them first, because and wait for the period of maturation, wait for the period where those technologies become just cheaper. Good enough is the principle for you. But with disruptive technologies that offer some extra capabilities, either through extra performance or through better cost effectiveness, indeed this becomes more interesting for second-tier actors. But then this is defined by the operational environment, and which brings me to the paper which we have just launched a couple of days ago. This is a product of an unclassified version of the product of the Strategic Defense Review that we have just finished, and which lasted around a year. And this review has focused on a realistic analysis of the environment, and on the realistic analysis of our resources. And this brings us to a conclusion that we have to focus. I mean, in Poland, we have to focus on high-intensity scenarios in our vicinity. Doesn't mean that Poland will cease to become a valuable ally in other contingencies. We have been thinking of how to make ourselves more valuable, more, I mean, contributing more in other contingencies, but it is important for us and other allies that we become more competent in a defense of our territory or in a defense of the vicinity. That brings me to the sort of operational concept.
Okay.
And
Sorry.
can I?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you. A2AD, I mean, I think that we are first ally that, first of all, acknowledges us others that we will have to act in the highly contested environment, A2AD environment, but we will also develop our own A2AD complex.
Okay.
First of all, to defend ourselves and to create sanctuary for the allied maneuver. A2AD is a concept based on defense. Defense is a stronger way of warfare, as Clausewitz put it. Current development of technologies favors defense, so we are thinking along the lines of cost effectiveness, simplicity as well. So, you know, for instance, sensor to shooter has to be simple. We are, and in terms of domains, we are naturally observing the development of cyber and info domains, and we are multiplying the investment there, but we also acknowledge that the war is to be decided in a physical environment, and the high-intensity part of the spectrum costs most money. Yesterday at the dinner, Professor Lindley French dubbed the term of the analog defense versus cyber defense, but still analog defense costs much more, and you cannot do without it. To disruptive technologies, I already mentioned cyber and info domain. When it comes to automation and autonomization, I mean, for instance, drones, we put more stress on simpler and more, as General Bridlov has mentioned. For instance, there is some question with regard to the current strike role of drones. I mean, there are some platforms that you know, remotely piloted that you can use quite effectively in Afghanistan or Iraq, but in a highly contested environment, that might be questionable. So we are thinking of either massive investment into ISR drones or kamikaze drones. We are already developing them, and our territorial defense units are going to be equipped with such technologies similar to those that ICC is using, but probably more professionally developed. Lastly, I think that there's a great promise with the whole aspect of directed energy. Also for second tier actors, that area may render some of the defensive technologies more effective. For instance, ground-based missile defense might become much more cost effective. And lastly, some of the aspects of directed energy might also allow us to control better de-escalation ladder. So for instance, versus actors that want to harass us with use of tactical nuclear forces.
So, Ms. Krebs, when we look at all of these different things that go into the idea of a disruptive technology, I'm imagining a policymaker sort of scratching his head and going, well, I feel like I've got a great handle on what's going to be disruptive. What do you think governments around the world, and particularly the US government, is missing when we talk about what's going to disrupt the way militaries do business?
So thank you for being here, and I appreciate being part of this panel. So as I was thinking about the theme of the panel, I was doing some preparation or procrastination by watching the Google Development Conference, which happened last week, and Mark Zuckerberg's commencement address at Harvard just a few days ago. And so these guys are both obviously, or that this company and this individual are at the vanguard of what I think are very sort of disruptive and cutting edge technologies. And I thought, well, what can we learn from what they're saying? And this development conference is amazing because these ideas that come out in this conference are really ones that I think, at least from a defense perspective, we're always sort of trying to emulate. But it struck me that there are 4 reasons why that's very difficult to do, and that there are these cultural sort of asymmetries that are likely to create some, at least impediments to fully embracing and implementing disruptive technologies. And the first one came out of a comment that Mark Zuckerberg made in his commencement address. And he was encouraging all these graduates to go out and take whatever idea they have and just run with it. And they were going to make it, that he knew that people would get mad from these ideas because good ideas often run into friction. And so I thought about the defense perspective on this, right? So 90% of 90% of technologies fail in Silicon Valley. I mean, 90%. You cannot have a technology in the military that fails 90% of the time. I mean, people will be killed. And so I think the incentives and structure of how Silicon Valley works versus how the Defense Department works are just so fundamentally different. It reminded me of a technology that was deployed at an unmanned ground vehicle that was deployed to Iraq in 2007. And it was sort of automated. It was meant to actually kind of actually carry out lethal force, but there were some early indications that it wasn't going exactly as it was engineered. And so they pulled it from the field. And the logic was that if you make a mistake, I mean, you have fratricide, you have civilian casualties. None of these are things that are acceptable or helpful on the battlefield. So that was one, sort of the failure issue. Another was this issue of stovepipes, which anyone who's been in the military will be very familiar with. But so many of these technologies that Google uses are open source. Everything's open, and it's the sort of the hive mind. And I mean, Wikipedia is exactly this. People contribute. This is exactly the opposite of how the military functions. A skiff, for example, is exactly meant to break people apart and separate them based on the need to know. And what we know, of course, in office spaces in Silicon Valley right now is they're created sort of to facilitate these coincidental interactions that can facilitate new unexpected ideas. That can't happen when people are divided by skiffs. So that was sort of a second thing. A third has to do with sort of hierarchy versus flatness, and you know, it's not to say that these firms in Silicon Valley are entirely flat. They're not. But I think there's certainly democratization of ideas in Silicon Valley. I was looking up the list of Silicon Valley billionaires, and like 30 of them are under the age of 30. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so, you know, the CEO of Dropbox, who's a multi-billionaire, founded it when he was 24. And it reminded me of when I was a captain in the Air Force, and I wanted to do my PhD, and the colonel said, well, what am I going to do with a 28-year-old captain with a PhD? Like, it's just a very different mindset about where good ideas can come from. So that's the sort of hierarchy versus flatness. And then the last is sort of the motives of a defense department versus industry. Industry wants to want to make money, frankly. The government wants to make sure they're protecting their people. They're not for profit. I was visiting an automation lab at Duke University last year, and a lot of it is like with drones. And I was asking them about how they envisioned the deconfliction of airspace when you have thousands or millions of civilian drones. And I said, so who's working on that? And they said, well, nominally or technically NASA is, but the real idea is going to come from Amazon. And the reason is that Amazon has skin in the game financially to make this work. Now, Amazon won't implement it, but they'll come up with the idea, pitch it to the government, this will all get massaged, and then we'll go off and do it.
I would almost argue that if not Amazon, then probably Google, just because Larry Page wants a flying car real bad. Like real mad. And they also have an active program in developing drones for commercial delivery. So one of those two. But on this nexus between what Silicon Valley is doing, what Washington is doing, and what the adversary is doing, General Bromberg, where do you see the most technological acceleration happening? Where do you see the big disruptor emerging between those three sides?
Well, thanks for having us again, and thanks to the panels. This is really pretty interesting. Such a broad topic, but it comes to me when we listen to all the panelists. It's all about denying our ability to operate freely. And no matter what space we're talking about, whether it's A2AD, is it ground space, is it naval space, is it airspace, is it thought space, is it our ability to operate freely in our banking systems? It crosses every single aspect of our ability to operate as we desire to operate in our societies. So when I look at that, I think the next great technological advantage And as our historian pointed out, a lot of these are not as great as they think,
Right.
but it's going to come from the intersection of multiple ones.
Okay.
It's not going to be just one. You're going to have to combine these together in a way that you can put them all together. So we already mentioned cyber and a few other things, but let's look at the terms of non-kinetic.
Okay.
So within non-kinetic, you have several areas you can look at. You can start with, someone mentioned lasers.
Does everyone know this term kinetic? Okay. Kinetic kills you.
So we want to go non-kinetic.
Right.
That to me is that area, very broad. It is not just what we're thinking, is it just lasers? Lasers is a piece of that. Clearly is a piece of that, because you'll have unlimited magazine depth or unlimited ability with no resupply. Very inexpensive. It changes logistics. It changes the footprint. It changes the size of forces. And it does what you can do as long as you can have precision. So you need precision in all of this. So you'll have non-kinetics with lasers. Additionally, then you go after things like the cyber piece that we talked about.
Yeah.
And you apply that wherever you desire to apply it on the battlefield or in the other spaces across. Then what about smaller ammunition that's non-kinetic but's guided? What about anti-vehicle specific munitions that is, again, non-kinetic but designed to do one shot, one kill on one vehicle? What about anti-personnel non-kinetic capability? So again, you can see we can start branching this out, but then how do you bring it all back together? That's where the challenge is. So industry, one thing that we're doing in industry, I see in all our industry partners, is innovation and incubation. Having innovation centers, the ability to put people to have that 90% failure rate that was talked about, so you can put these ideas together.
Yeah.
And then after you put them together, say, okay, what are the challenges? It's okay to fail in the innovation lab.
Yeah.
But then you can make the decisions that you want to go forward, and
Yeah.
then you have to bring it back to see how you could put it all together. Can you imagine it where you have cyber, lasers, precision-guided small weapons that are non-kinetic, put all that together, and then put it in a very congested airspace with multiple drones? Who's
Right.
going to manage that, and how you're going to think about that? So I think if we can master the integration of these different technologies, that's where we'll end up making the major disruptive piece.
Right. So I think that there's some barriers to the way the West, in particular, can use disruptive technology, and those barriers stem from the fact that we've got rules. We've got an international coalition that we've got to, stay together. We've got people that we have to be accountable to. We've got to be accountable to the international media, and the adversary often doesn't have that. Even a state adversary like Russia will lie about their activities. Non-state adversaries don't have rules. That's why they're non-state. So I wonder if there's a disconnect between our ability to leverage the disruptive technologies that we create and the rules that we have to live by as a military in our ability to use those. So, General Breedlove, you've had some experience here. Do we have too many rules to be disruptive?
Well, I think the civil answer is no. We are a principled society. We talk often in NATO. I can't speak for those nations outside of NATO, but we talk often in NATO about what defines us and what keeps us together are our values. So we just can't toss the rules out the window. But I think what we have to do is take a mature view of how these disruptive technologies might be used on us. There are portions of what we do as a military force in NATO that need to remain governed by our civilian leadership. And there are also portions, however, of the battle that we may face that I think if you have to wait for a NAC decision to respond, you will be overcome.
Right.
You will suffer the consequences. And so I think the tough part of these is to get together now and look at those policies that we need to change. In the Wales and then Warsaw summit, they began to do this when they re-empowered the SACEUR to take certain actions on generating and staging force that was previously held by the NAC. But I think that these decisions that need to be made prior to attack are the key right now. Sitting down and thinking of the disruptive capabilities that both the state and non-state actors can bring to bear on us. Deciding which are the ones where we need to be able to allow those who would respond, either the military or civil cyber or whoever has the capability, but enabling them so that they can respond at speed. I think that's the secret sauce.
Okay.
But just to recoup, I don't think we throw our values over our shoulder
Yeah.
and just move out. We have to take a principled look at those things that we need to be able to act quickly on in order to avoid catastrophe. And then we need to enable the forces that would respond at speed without having to wait for decisions.
All right, I want everybody to start thinking about questions, and as they come to you, raise your hand and we'll get to them. But
Can I add on something for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So to that point also, I think that's where you have to bring the policy innovators in at the same time you're doing the technology development. Because to me, if you can put the brain power together earlier, so as we're developing technological advances, what about the advances in policy? So you can start looking at how you'd apply these weapons, as we're speaking about weapons, or how we do these other things. Does it make sense? Would we ever employ it? I mean, what are those decisions that you'd want to make as you're designing? Because you'll design it differently for command and control purposes and decision processes if you knew some of that up front.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to bring up an example of a discussion that is ongoing now. And that is, as we begin to feel the capability of our European phase adaptive approach and the Aegis Ashore sites, first in Romania and then in Poland, the capability to be able to defend Europe is really beginning to become a reality. What is not well understood in our publics and frankly among some of our political decision makers is the speed of the decisions that have to be made. These missile shots can be as short as 4.5 minutes.
Yeah.
Some of them, the longest, would be 8.5 or 9 minutes. Tell me, can you convene a NAC and decide what to do in 4.5 minutes or 8.5 minutes? Can you even call your capital and get through to a decision maker in 4.5 minutes?
Yeah.
And so we have to enable our missile defense forces to understand what their pre-existing rules of engagements are, such that if there's a shot to one of our capitals, our fielded forces know exactly what their rules of engagement and special instructions are to engage that target. If we try to make decisions while the missile is in flight, we will come to that decision after CNN International is reporting on the damage that was already done.
Yeah, this is something that I hear a lot from commanders, particularly for example, Mike Rogers, Admiral Mike Rogers, the head of Cyber Command, who points out that there are a lot of cyber operations that should be done at the tip of the spear by an operator that's actually pretty close to the action that he actually needs presidential approval for, because that entire area is so poorly understood by policymakers that they treat it almost like it's radioactive when actually you're talking about a pretty simple operation that should be at the operator level. Do you see like a lot of those different decisions that should, it sounds like you do, be left up to the operator that are today governed by way too much bureaucracy in terms of the authorities?
So that's a loaded question. There's a lot of sort of superlatives in there, but I would just say that yes, there are things that we need to be addressing now that will happen at speed that we need to be able to react to. We need to make those policy decisions now rather than discussing them when they begin to unfold, because then it's too late.
Okay. I'll turn that to Secretary Shatowski too. How do you handle that dilemma where you've got to, on the one hand, be incredibly quick and reactive and enable your commander at the front line, but you also need to maintain strict top-down control? How do you manage that balance?
I agree with General Bridov. We are moving in many areas into pre-authorization assumptions. Yeah, so this is basically the way to do it. I mean, with such a pace of the warfare environment, you couldn't do otherwise.
Okay. Again, if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand. And we've already got some. All right, let's shoot. Over here to this gentleman.
Thank you. I'm General Campoli, former Chief of Defense in Italy and former fighter pilot as well. We are talking about, for sure, policy, technology, procedures. But I am afraid that we are putting too much weight on technology, not because we do not need it, but because we might rely too much on it. In the past, we had several examples of the technology illusion. We do not need only technology. We do need also numbers. Numbers at any level, the number of soldiers, the number of aircraft, the number of ships. While in the West, we are reducing these numbers, and I do not see any specific move towards an improvement of the situation. I hear about some countries considering reintroducing draft. This is not the solution. I think we should be very careful about that because in the West we are few,
Yeah.
and the others are many.
Okay. Let me turn that a little bit into a question. Are we right now relying a little bit too much on big, expensive breakthrough technology in the absence of an actual force to carry out policy? What I think H.R. McMaster, back when he was head of TRADOC, would say, the ability of forces on the ground to consolidate gains and hold territory versus the ability to, say, take out a particular target with a drone from 3,000 miles away, but you're not going to hold that ground, and so you're going to lose it as soon as he vanishes. Ms. Krabs, yeah.
I think we're all old enough to know that these things always kind of fluctuate in cycles. And so I worked at the National Reconnaissance Office for a while, and that was right around the time of the Iraq War and the realization that they hadn't had WMD. And so there was this sense of, oh, we need more human, less technology, because that was after the FIA debacle as well, where we had spent billions and billions and billions on imagery, and it didn't work very well. And so then we went more to the human intelligence side. And then came drones. And I think one of the things that was very interesting about President Obama's sort of exit interviews was kind of a confessional tone about, you know, I was seduced by the technology. This technology came along, we were all seduced by it. And I think that one of the reasons, kind of coming back to one of the discussion points a couple of minutes ago, one of the reasons it seems that there was this, a bit of removal of delegation was that there was a lot of collateral damage in those early years of the use of drones. I mean, some
Right.
estimates of like 15 to 20% civilian casualties. And so all of this, again, kind of comes back to these cycles, the action-reaction policy, learning, which is good. We should be learning from mistakes. But the pendulum then often swings too far, and then we have to kind of recorrect.
All right. General Bartlett, you had something on this.
So I don't disagree with what's said. In fact, I agree with it. But to your question directly, having been the vice chief of one of our services during sort of the downturn of the size of our forces, very, very, very few of the conversations I heard were about we can reduce because of technology. The reduction was because of the peace dividend. We were into almost a decade and a half of trying to make a strategic partner out of Russia, and so we didn't need these large forces, and the drawdown discussions were less about we are better because of the technology. They're more about we simply don't need this force because we don't have that large strategic actor. So I would offer that as a second opinion in this particular case. In the West, though, you say we are getting smaller. I think if you look at I can only speak for my nation, but if you look at our budget that was just turned in, our services are growing again. We have we have made the realization that we are too small. In some services, like the Army and the Marines, we don't have enough fighting forces to be able to deploy them on the cycles that we need. In the United States Air Force, we're short of maintenance and pilots to enable our weapon system. And so I think that there are a lot of dynamics there as well, but the bottom line is at least our budget has recognized that we're too small and we're turned around and headed in the other direction.
So let me go to Stefan. Your thoughts on this? Are we relying a little bit too much in the West on technology to offset numbers and troops, or to create distance where there shouldn't be, or is our interest in technology more appropriate to or aligned with possibilities of victory?
Well, I want to answer that by taking sort of a long-term view of military competition in general. And I'm actually sort of also going to pose a question, perhaps someone here can answer that. It just occurred to me a few minutes ago, and that is there actually a penalty of taking the lead in this military technological competition? That is, if the West consistently introduces expensive new military hardware that at some point is going to get disseminated or adopted or picked up by peer competitors, are we not are we not actually getting punished here financially? If you think about how much a submarine costs in Russia versus how much a submarine costs in the United States, for example, I mean, it's 1, 2, 3. The United States will have an aircraft carrier that will cost $13 billion before it's even, operational. And I'm thinking about this idea, there's an Ukrainian-American economist, Alexander Gershon, who came up with this concept of the comparative advantage of relative backwardness in the 20th century. And he essentially was, trying to figure out why Germany was so good at overtaking Great Britain at the end of the 19th century in terms of economic power. If you apply this now to the military competition and think about the Chinese-US military competition, for example, and look at some of the stuff that the Chinese are developing, I'm just wondering whether we get penalized in the West developing these expensive military hardware, that at some point the other side is going to get a lot cheaper.
Yeah,
maybe not the same quality, but at least quantity-wise.
Yeah.
What the gentleman over there said.
Yeah, well, it's an excellent point. Right now in Somalia, for instance, we know that against al-Shabaab, Somali forces are carrying out drone strikes with money that we've given them using drones made by China. So that's a kind of terrifying reality to have to live with. But let me go to you, Phil.
Can I
because think
just
you would say
close
that
this
one.
out with one short statement, which I think is important? In my opinion, this is not a zero-sum game. It's not technology or people. In fact, right now, our technology is enabled by people. Tell me how many truly autonomous weapons do we have? Does anybody know of one truly autonomous? So our people are still in the loop. We call them RPAs in the Air Force, remotely piloted aircraft, to remind that every drone, which is the word that people like to use, has multiple pilots behind it flying it. And so we need not only the great kit, we need to continue the move forward in refurbishing, refitting, rekitting our forces, but we have to also remember that it is the excellence of the troops in the West that really sets us apart from our adversaries. Our kit are drawing closer and closer together over time. It's our troops that make the difference, in my opinion.
Right. So, Secretary Shatowski, this is a thing that you have to face all the time. On the one hand, you've got allies that want to sell you incredibly exquisite and amazing pieces of military technology, and at the same time, you're looking at adversaries that are able to adapt really quickly just by borrowing, by stealing, and by reappropriating technology in a new way. How do you make a distinction about what you want to do in that sort of situation?
Yeah, so in this paper, we clearly spell out that in recent past, we've overemphasized quality as a superior notion over quantity. And we are, and the A2AD environment, highly contested environments, is certainly not permissive for a smaller number of more exquisite platforms. This is one notion. But also in terms of the personnel, I mean, a number of armed forces in the alliance have gone far with the reduction, with the assumption or assertion that there will be an increase of quality.
Yeah.
But actually, as you were losing quantity, you were also losing as you were losing quantity, you were also losing quality, because with less people, for instance, you cannot exercise certain aspects. For instance, if you lose the divisional level capability, you cannot exercise some aspects of combined arms.
Yeah.
So actually, this is so in terms of the personnel, we are actually reversing the trend of 30 years. 30 years ago, in 1987, Polish armed forces of then People's Republic of Poland started to reduce number of our forces, and it took 30 years for us now to reverse this trend. And this goes also to technology. We need to rely more on robust, more simple systems and less on exquisite platforms. which doesn't mean that we'll not buy,
Yeah.
for instance, fifth generation fighters some years from now.
I think that General Bromberg's very relieved by that.
Yes, the Lockheed Martin people were one of those who were mostly, thrilled by this paper.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'd love to get into this idea that somehow you can make a Super Hornet into a stealth fighter because the physics says that that doesn't happen. But let's go over here.
Fifth generation aircraft.
My name is Radodanak. My previous startup was supplier to SOCOM, INSCOM, DCGSA, and you name it, Ford, and so on. And we talk about the new technologies, disruptive, basically technologies coming to military space, and then different culture between Bay Area or Silicon Valley and military technology. Today is dominated by prime contractors. And mechanism to get disruptive technology from smaller companies going through the budgeting cycles, guaranteed protest, and mechanisms how basically prime contractors basically protect their space is leading to the fact that, for example, today, it was in President reports from January this year, that in supercomputer technology, United States supercomputer technology is 5 times slower than Chinese because the prime contractors did not allow the technology basically to reach the market. And new technology which underpins the intelligence drones and so on, this swap size, weight and power 20 to 100 times better, just did not reach the market because of this infrastructure. So the question is, what can be done and changed in the way how the basically things is developed and procured to enable this disruptive innovation from Silicon Valley to be really basically materialized and then lead up to fielding of that. Thank you.
So, General Bromberg, you're the prime of the primes.
Well,
Is Lockheed capable of self-disruption?
I wouldn't call it self-disruption, but I think one thing that Lockheed does do is and I'm not here to talk about that. I want to talk about the bigger problem, and that's the problem of how you do rapid acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a problem that every nation faces. How do you move through a process that you can do good analysis of comparative products and make a rapid decision? Because these are expensive products for everybody. I don't care what nation you're in. It is a very expensive product. So you have to make, and they're long-lasting products. So they're very serious and weighty decisions. So I think first piece is innovation and embracing innovation. Just because companies are big doesn't mean they partner with smaller companies. We see this all the time across industry. We're always outreaching into multiple smaller companies. We're looking at ideas. We're bringing ideas in. We're always chatting with people on how we can bring ideas to the table. But then getting that process into the acquisition process. Just because you're a large company doesn't mean you don't follow any different rules than smaller companies do.
Yeah.
So I think you have to look at the different acquisition processes. And then when you go around the different nations, every nation has their own process of doing decision making. Getting a timely decision from nations, it doesn't matter again what nation, getting that timely decision so you can bring that technology to bear at a reasonable cost and one that is also going to be with that country for a long time is the key. So I think acquisition reform.
Yeah.
I know we discussed yesterday also within the NATO context, how do we look at, are there other ways to do, we've heard the term smart buying, are there other ways to do smart buying that can be utilized to increase competition as well as also make decisions? Are there advantages for smaller countries to partner with larger companies to still get the products they want?
Yeah.
So I think it's a combination of innovating, partnering with smaller countries, and also looking at acquisition reform based upon your own national structure.
Yeah. I think this goes back to something that Ms. Krebs was talking about at the very beginning. If there wasn't something terribly wrong with the way we acquired things, then we wouldn't need a rapid acquisition fund, because all that tells you is that regular acquisition is not rapid. And we also would need a Silicon Valley Outreach Center, and we also would need a Strategic Capabilities Office. So, Ms. Krebs, it seems like we're developing within the Pentagon a bunch of workarounds for the bigger acquisition problem without actually addressing that acquisition problem head on. Can acquisition be saved?
That's a good question for you to answer.
Yeah.
It is. I went to my first defense acquisition class in 1999, and they were touting the 777 as like the new thing in defense acquisitions. And it was a problem almost 20 years ago, probably even longer ago. And they've been trying to come up with new lingo for how to improve it. Spiral acquisition, right? And so I think there are a lot of efforts that have made some headway, but I think that those for structural barriers that I mentioned at the outset are pretty significant. One of the things I would also point to, I mean, you talked about Pentagon West or Silicon Valley of defense, or the DIUX, where the partnerships between some of those kind of non-traditional defense firms and defense, at least in principle, seem like they're well-intentioned. I haven't actually seen output from it. They seem to be touting the fact that everyone goes to work wearing a hoodie. I don't think that's a deliverable necessarily. But you know, but I do see some of the smaller defense firms at least carving out niches that are important. So Textron with some of its tactical UAVs, AeroVironment in California. So when I was out at Stanford a couple of summers ago as a fellow, they were saying that Stanford engineering grads in sort of the hardware side, the top place they want to go as graduates is Tesla, and the second is AeroVironment. But actually, I think that's a close second. I mean, if Tesla's kind of a sexy firm to work for, but the fact that AeroVironment is still up there for Stanford grads, I think, and AeroVironment, of course, is a purveyor for defense technology, I think is indicating that there is some degree of change in how that's working.
Yeah, and you know what, I think that the real mover is the level of urgency that's felt by the operator, and getting that level of urgency communicated in a quick way. For instance, back a couple months ago, SOCOM put out an urgent request for exactly what you're talking about. The AeroVironment makes these little drones called Switchblade drones, and they're basically little kamikaze drones. You shoot them out of a cannon, they fly overhead, and it's like a loitering munition. It powers the thing. So there was a special urgent request for about 350 rounds of these. And if not for that urgent request coming from the operator at the tip of the spear, then that acquisition goal is never met. So there's got to be, I think, some better way to streamline that operator need to command. And all of these little endeavors are kind of ways to do it, but that's really where the demand signal's got to, I think, kind of come from. And until that's part of the way we acquire things holistically, I don't see you having a solution. Let's go right here.
Question for, I think, possibly for Dr. Krebs. Somebody mentioned that there are 30 billionaires who were young kids, came out of Silicon Valley. If you're a young kid and you think you've got a bright idea in the defense sector, how do you pitch it to the defense sector? Where do you go? What's the channel? After all, why are all the 30 billionaires, as it were, in the civilian sector, not in the defense? Logically, you would have thought one of those 30, if not more, would be in the defense sector.
Maybe you have ideas on this. I think this is a significant problem. I think if you're that person, you drop out of college and you work in your parents' garage and you come up with the idea and then you pitch it to Google. But I don't know that there's and I think that's what DIUX is trying to do is sort of facilitate that, but I don't think there's any mechanism for that sort of process taking place within.
Could I just say that I just watched this process work in the soft world in the last 2 weeks, where 2 young men developed a very lightweight garment that is an automatic way to stop blood loss if you're hurt on the battlefield and someone can't get to you quickly. Very light, very easy way to initiate a self-tourniquet to stop bleeding. And what they did was they went out and said, who would want this and could establish a requirement? They met people in the special forces world who tended to work more alone and more at distance from medical care, and went and in a spirit of entrepreneurial effort, found the person that might have the requirement. Sure enough, the requirement was set, and now they're well along their way to being able to work this into the soft world. And so it's not enough to be a smart inventor if you also are not an entrepreneur who goes out and finds out how to connect to requirements to bring a mating of a capability to a requirement.
Yeah, so it's interesting because all the services acquire things sort of differently. And probably the most rapid is exactly this, the Special Operations Forces guys that have both an ability to go out there and get technology really quickly, but also more latitude to acquire things that they're going to have to share with partner militaries, because the SCOF guys in particular don't acquire things by themselves. So in terms of a service to reach out to, they're probably the most open to these young entrepreneurs that you're thinking of. But it's a big problem.
I just want to add, and this won't answer your whole question, but just from an industry's perspective, I know it's very competitive amongst the industry. As one of our major efforts all year round is seeking out talent across the global economy. All different types of talent, very competitive, starting, we hold competitions to seek talent out. Even down at the high school level, we're starting to bring people in with industry funding to say, hey, here's a project, here's a problem, go show us how you solve it. And then we track those individuals. We try to encourage them, one, for their own and the national benefit or the global benefit, to increase their educational skills to compete in the global market. But we are constantly seeking out talent throughout the world. Again, that's not going to solve everybody who's in their, like you say, parents' garage. But again, we try to give them that structure. And I'll also tell you that in the some of these smart young folks that also have a sense of dedication to national defense do seek out defense industry because they find that's a good environment for them to work in, because they do feel like they're contributing to a long-term goal. And that, everybody's different, it's humans, so they have a human factor that fits what they want as well. It's not everybody's cut out to be the entrepreneur either. But we do seek these folks all year round, all around the globe. And I know all our friends and competitors and teammates in industry do the same thing. It's very competitive.
All right, more questions?
Thank you.
Yes, right there, the lady in that row right there.
From the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Just to respond, I have two comments. General Breedlove, you threw out some very interesting grenades there at the beginning, very provocative. And you mentioned Hollywood. And as we know, during World War II, Hollywood was used to help create the anti-Nazi message. But there hasn't been a negative film on China in 20 years. So the Chinese have understood that probably better than the United States. And in today's New York Times, there's an op-ed written by Neil Sheehan, part of the 1967 Vietnam series. And he starts with, there are some events which can be understood only with the perspective of time. And let's not forget, Vietnam beat the US with very, very low tech.
Yeah.
What we've seen now in Crimea, we've seen little green men in Crimea, little blue men in the South China Sea. China's salami slicing technique of just doing things below the radar so the US military can't respond has been proven very successful. Now they have 7 islands, artificial islands that are militarized. So if the US becomes more technological, I think adversaries will become more asymmetric in their approach. How do we respond? Thanks.
So that, could I challenge one sentence you said? Doing things in a salami slice way so that America can't respond. I don't think can't is the right word. We could respond, but we choose not to. I think the dilemma you're painting is that they're taking actions below a threshold at which they think they can get away with it. We certainly have the capability to respond, we just choose not to. So I don't know if you agree with that sort of correction of the conundrum. I think it's important. And I think
That's sort of related to that chart that you showed me last night. There's an entire chart that exists where there's a threshold of activity, and as long as we're operating beneath it, then we're vulnerable to all sorts of activity.
If you Google Gerasimov doctrine and hit images, you'll find a chart that he builds where he talks about his war, I call it war below the lines, and he calls it indirect means and methods. But in this chart, you look at how they approach this, what some call hybrid war. I don't like that word, but some call hybrid war. And what the Gerasimov doctrine talks about is how much you can get away with in an individual country. In some countries, you can get very far right on the chart and you're at a very high line, a very high threshold. In other countries, you get away with certain things and your threshold is lower. But the point that I get from that chart as I read what's in this thing is that this is active in almost every nation. It is certainly active in my nation.
Do you think that we're becoming more vulnerable to those indirect means, or are we becoming more impervious to them because we're having a conversation about them more frequently now in the wake of the 2016 election meddling?
So I think the answer is yes and no. We are more vulnerable because, again, we haven't taken the policy decisions to respond below those lines. We could respond in information warfare. We have chosen really not to take the field. We could respond in cyber. We have distinct limitations, as you heard, on what we can do in cyber. So we have policy that sets a certain threshold, and our opponents are finding out exactly where that threshold is, and they're operating to their greatest extent below that, knowing that we won't respond. So the real discussion is, to what will we allow ourselves to be subjected before we move out?
Right.
And then clearly, in some cases, technology, some of it could change this conundrum.
All right, Ms. Creditor, you had something on that.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think the domain matters a lot, and I'm glad you brought up cyber, because I think that introduces a whole new degree of sort of reluctance to engage, because of the sense that any response is sort of disproportionate. So I've done these experiments and I create these cyber 9/11 scenarios, like really apocalyptic scenarios where thousands of Americans are dying because of a cyber attack, sort of a kinetic attack, and you cannot get people to say that they will retaliate using kinetic responses because they're worried about escalation. And if you think, so there's sort of the public opinion piece of this, which I think is very important. But what that does, of course, is play into the deterrence or the lack of deterrence, right? Because the potential sort of offending country knows or anticipates that we won't respond because of this sort of the hurdle that it takes from public opinion.
Yeah, so one of the things we talked about last night in dealing with this is a whole of government response. We've got military, you've got economic, you've got diplomatic. Are we using those levers effectively right now against an adversary like Russia? Oh, that's to you. That's to you.
I'm happy to answer. I just want to see if anybody else was. I think not. I think that if we look at individual actions that we have faced in the recent past, we have done things in a very unbalanced manner. We are being attacked in a whole of government way. If you look at what happened in Ukraine, you see diplomatic efforts to discredit Kyiv and everything Kyiv does. You see an intense information campaign attacking the credibility of the government and the connection of the government to the people. You clearly see a Russian military action enabling the folks in the east, and Russian direct action in the east, etc. And you see an economic piece where Russia attacks via energy pricing, recalling of loans, et cetera, et cetera. So you see a broad, all-of-government approach. We in the West tend to not answer in a broad, all-of-government answer. If you will allow me to use the silly little model that we use in war colleges called DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. What did we do in Libya? We had very little D. We had hardly any I. We had a massive M, and we had almost no E. So we threw the military at Libya with no plans for diplomatic, informational, economic. And you see what we ended up in. In Ukraine, how have we responded? Some diplomatic efforts, almost zero informational efforts, very limited military efforts, and a pretty strong package of economic sanctions. And so again, a very unbalanced approach to the Ukrainian problem when they're being attacked broadly across all of the elements. And so I think the NATO for years has been talking about the comprehensive approach, but we really don't answer attacks on us with a comprehensive response. And I think that there is much to be gained by understanding that we have to meet an all-of-government attack with an all-of-government response.
Secretary Shatowski, as one of our NATO allies, is that something that you perceive? Do you perceive the U.S. across government response to Russian activity as sufficient or insufficient?
I agree that there are limits in a democracy to what you can do in terms of the interagency response. For instance, certain full spectrum measures need to be overseen by the parliament, by the Congress. So you cannot act in the utmost secrecy like the Putin's regime can. They are much better in orchestrating those instruments. At the same time, obeying those rules creates a society which is based on the freedom, which is more fertile to producing things that we are talking today about. I mean, the disruptive technologies. So these are two sides of one coin.
Okay, more questions here. Right here in the front row.
Hi, Justin Vogt, Foreign Affairs Magazine. General Breedlove, I want to take the bait on one of the things you said at the outset. You talked about human genome editing and seemed to sort of relish the prospect that might lead to the engineering of a better soldier. Is that something that you are actually comfortable with? And are there, and I want to know this because obviously I wonder if you're comfortable with the Chinese doing it. I wonder if you're comfortable with everybody doing it. That seems like, I know you said it sounds crazy, but I agree with you that a lot of stuff that sounds crazy and science fiction becomes science fact, and that is actually out there. And with CRISPR, it's become only more of a potential. So I want to poke at that a little bit more.
So you actually answered your own question in that whether I'm comfortable with it or not is almost irrelevant. Remember,
but are you?
So you're not going to get that answer. Let me just tell you right now. I have the mic, so you're not going to get that answer. The bottom line is that I think this is going to happen, and many other people think this is going to happen. And I've said at least twice in this conference, in either other sessions or answering, the enemy gets a vote. We will face this in the future.
Yeah.
The same way that people sort of look at Star Wars and think about the X-Wing fighter and they laugh, just like we laughed at the Star Trek communicators. We will eventually fight in space. It is going to happen. And so I think that we have to choose to be able to deal with it.
Yeah. So right now, as context, the military has a couple of different research avenues into this area. DARPA, in 2014, I believe, stood up a new biotechnology office that approaches synthetic biology as a potential threat area. The Air Force Research Lab is doing some really interesting and important work in biotechnology research, but that's mostly in terms of understanding how different pathogens might be weaponized and also creating better supplements. Of course, if you look at different cultural attitudes towards human genome editing in, say, China, which is in many ways leading research in this, you're going to find something very different than the sort of norms that we're used to. So right here on the front row, who I've been neglecting for a while, right there.
Thank you. Yes, Brooks Tigner, Jane's Defense Brussels. If we're to believe the predictions and the projections and all of the pronouncements about AI, then indeed in the future of warfare is machine to machine, with increasingly fewer people needed to make these machines run if they don't run them by themselves. So my question to any of you on the panel is, have you studied, or would you care to hazard a guess about by how much flesh and blood armies are going to shrink in the future as machines take over warfare? Because logic would suggest that is going to happen. And also in the knowledge that it's going to be very difficult for future politicians to justify both of these expensive components. Thank you.
So while others are thinking, I'll kick it off. I much as I did up here, I would disagree with your last sentence. You said logic would suggest this is going to happen. I think that what we have learned consistently over time is that while huge forces are required to fight, and that may change over time, you're not going to be able to occupy and or rebuild with a tiny force. We are always going to end up in a place where we need to be able to administer, or use other words if you want, control or whatever, territory, and to be able to control those various spheres of warfare from land, air, sea, space, cyber, etc. And those will always take people. I truly believe, I flew the F-16 for 26 years. I think technology is an amazing thing. The F-16 I flew back in the early 80s was incredibly different than the one that I flew when I stopped as a major general in the Air Force. But all across time, one thing has been very steady: the requirement for a soldier, sailor, airman, or a Marine to do their job and to hold the ground, air, land, sea, space, or cyber after an attack. So I just must tell you, you asked my opinion, I must tell you, I don't think that we will ever have a time where our force will shrink down to, you know, the one guy playing the piccolo at the computer board, driving exquisite weaponry.
I think there's one other aspect. In these situations where you have a force, the person on the other side is going to be a human more than likely. And whether it's a civilian population, I don't see the interaction between somebody on the other side who's not the soldier, who is the non-combatant, interacting with a machine. I think that's going to there's still going to be a human element for a long, long time. I think humans will always be involved, but when it comes to this type of warfare, I just don't know, when you see these science fiction movies, I just don't know if a non-combatant or somebody who's just had their house destroyed is going to feel real comfortable with a robot coming up to them to tell them to go to block 27 for medical attention versus a person coming up to them with care and compassion. I think that, to me, is going to be a different part that technology will enable, but that you will always need that because the world's made of humans, and you're always going to need humans to interact with humans. So just a personal thought on that.
Can I just add that I think it will really depend on the context. For ISR, it completely makes sense to kind of turn this over to unmanned assets. But when you think about the differences between, getting back to this earlier comment about what makes good militaries, it is the people, and it's how those people interrelate and their esprit de corps, and those are functions of sort of human attributes. I don't think that the battlefield is a game of chess where you can have this robot that beats the best chess player in the world. I don't think the battlefield is like that. I disagree with my colleagues that think that you still will need, in these contexts, sort of the coming together of like a platoon level to go carry out the mission.
So no study projections by anyone on the size of each one?
I'll point you to a
It's
really
balanced.
interesting study. It's called The 10 Things We Learned from Star Wars. And one of them is they're stormtroopers.
But I do think you raised the question of balance.
Yeah.
In many of these topics today, it's been a balance about technology, it's been a balance about people, it's been a balance about budgets, a balance about decisions, it's
Yes.
a balance about policy. All these are constantly interplaying. I come back to my earlier point.
Okay.
That's where I think the disruptive technologies come in place. If you can bring these balances into a form where you do innovation in technology, innovation in policy, innovation in thought, innovation in artificial intelligence, that's where you'll find the disruptiveness.
All right.
Technology will enable that disruptiveness, but you've got to bring it together in a holistic fashion. If you can't bring it together in a holistic fashion, then we'll continue as we are.
I admire the ambition of trying to get military commanders to
question.
commit to a smaller force size. That would be historic if that happened in an open forum. Let's take one more question, and then we're going to go to concluding remarks. So who here has, right here in the center? Sure we can get him right there, that guy.
Sebulon Carlander, the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association from Sweden. So I'd just like to return to the historical perspective. There was previously a discussion about rules, and I'm just wondering if there are any lessons to learn from history when it comes to the introduction of new weapon systems, new weapon technologies, and the development of rules and norms regulating how those weapon systems are used. Thank you.
Well, I think the best example right now is, for example, cyber weapons in general, or cyber capabilities rather, right? And I've been part of a study a couple of years ago where we tried to adopt the Geneva and the Hague Conventions for cyberspace. And so we did a thorough study of those conventions. And ultimately what happens usually historically is at the beginning all of these things are fairly unregulated, usually. You go back to the Middle Ages and the introduction of the English longbow, for example. Some would classify that as a disruptive military technology. I tend to agree. It fundamentally changed the feudal system and ultimately made the mounted warrior obsolete in the long run. And they banned it. The church back then banned it. They issued, I think, even a papal bulletin. I might be wrong about that, but in any case, so anyone who would use a longbow in combat or a crossbow would be excommunicated, and if they were caught, I think, immediately executed. Now, this was obviously a very harsh example, but generally, I think it will take a lot of determination to really implement and put limits on some of these systems, because I think when they're out there and they will be used eventually. And that, of course, includes also all the new forms of warfare that we were talking about, with the exception, of course, of some of the things that we saw, during the Second World War, for example, with chemical warfare and stuff. So, I mean, some limitations may apply, but generally, I think it will be, particularly in the cyber field, will be very difficult to really limit any of these weapons.
Okay. So in thinking about how to sort of conclude here, I'd like to also propose a historical example that might be relevant to the discussion of military disruption. So my favorite disruptive military technology in history was the use of the arabesque by samurai warlord Oda Nobunaga in 1547. So here's what happened. Oda Nobunaga, samurai warlord, is holding a castle, and he's faced by a much larger force by Takada Katsuri. And this is a conventional force. Katsuri has pikemen, he's got cavalry, he's got archers. Nobunaga does this. He gets his arabesquers. This is 1547, and they're using guns that take like 5 minutes to load, basically, big muskets. And he sets them up in a round. And as the first wave approaches, the arabesquers lay him down. As the second wave of force approaches, the arabesquers just lay him down. And he basically created the first human machine gun. And everyone said that's a really dishonorable way to conduct warfare. But he held that castle, and then he took over Japan. So in closing, what is the arabesque technology in the next 5 to 10 years? And do we have it, or does the adversary? I'll start with you, General.
You're looking down. He's looking down here.
So I'm going to take the safe road out. If you want to talk the next 4 to 5 years, I go back to my original premise. The most disruptive things we could do is to readdress our policy and see how we can use the tools that we already have better. We find ourselves self-limiting.
Okay. Go ahead.
In a short-term perspective, I'm afraid this is the simplification of this system between the sensor and shooter, and I'm afraid that bad guys are at the moment a little bit better than us. In the longer term, I believe the directed energy will turn this relationship upside down, and actually the West has an upper hand with it.
Okay.
I'll step out and say precision-guided non-kinetic weapons.
Precision-guided non-connected weapons are the arabesque.
Yeah.
All right. That's good to know. Go ahead, Ms. Krebs.
I would say militarized civilian drones on the homeland.
Okay.
Sort of taking the idea of a suicide bomber that can find sort of the most densely populated area, but instead of blowing himself up, he kind of swoops in a drone and does it that way. And it won't be a weapon of mass destruction, but it will be a weapon of mass disruption, at least.
Okay. Well, actually, we have a touch more time than I originally thought. Let's on this question of the use of consumer drones in a incredibly disruptive way. Do we have a effective defense against that in a civilian setting? And if not, what are we doing about that? I'll go with you, Ms. Krebs.
Well, they were demonstrating one just outside here earlier.
Right.
I don't know if any of you saw this. So apparently there's some emerging technology. But I mean, I think like with everything, it's a cat and mouse game. It's like we come up with some sort of countermeasure and they'll come up with a countermeasure.
So I'd just say, I think we are working on technologies to counter this. The real problem is think of the scope.
Right.
How many of these kind of technologies would you need to protect Bratislava?
Yeah.
Right.
The
I mean,
scope
there's-
is really
there are
problematic.
infinite soft targets out there
Yeah.
that you would have to
Infinite soft
protect.
So especially when you talk about urban warfare and the use of these in an urban setting, the best technology we have to defend against them is jamming and EW. And you can't do that in an environment where you've got up to 5 million different cell phone users. That's not really going to work. So what is the technology that defeats small consumer drones in an urban warfare setting in the next 10 years? I'll go to you, Lieutenant General.
That's going to be a demand, but it's going to be, I think the quickest way, maybe not the quickest way, but I think one of the realistic ways, again, goes back to non-kinetics, because you have options in the electronic space, you have options in cyber, you have all kinds of options to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, now let's go to Stefan, who's going to
Yeah, I think that the one thing that worries me most
A lot of
in the next 5 to 10 years is the convergence of cyber with nuclear. And I think that's something we haven't touched yet. And that is the use of cyber capabilities really to target nuclear missile sites. And what this means really for nuclear strategic stability across the world. I think it's just the beginning of what we saw a few weeks ago with the revelations of the New York Times left launch operations in North Korea, and that's something really that I think needs to go out in the public and needs to be studied thoroughly in the unclassified level.
Yeah, so right now this is something of study at the Air Force Research Lab at the classified level. They've initiated a program to look at the future of networked nuclear weapons, because the theory is that you, in a modern military, you want all of your things to be networked, and looking at some of the vulnerabilities there. But I think that it's a hugely important reminder to keep on them as a populace, and me as the media, in terms of releasing the results of that sort of finding to the extent that it's possible, because we have to have a broad discussion about the interconnection of these weapon systems in order to have an informed policy discussion about whether or not that's a good idea. So with that, we've just about reached the end here. This concludes today's main session at the GlobSec Future 2007 Forum. But please don't forget the Night Owl Off the Record talks this evening, starting at 21:30. That's 9:30 for those of you who don't speak 21:30 language. For those attending the gala dinner, please note that there's going to be buses leaving from outside the hotel at 7:30. That's 5:30. And we're going to continue tomorrow at 9 a.m. With a groundbreaking off-the-record future talk with Mr. David Roberts from the Singularity University and Maria Theresa room. That's the Maria Theresa room is where that's going to take place. So I want you to please join me in thanking our panelists for this discussion. We'll talk a little bit more.
Very good.